Yo, what's up guys? Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a set review for Alchemy Edge of Eternities, the next Alchemy set that's going to be releasing on Arena, and it's coming out tomorrow, and I'm personally really excited for this one. I honestly think this is one of the best Alchemy sets that we've got in a while, not only because Alchemy's just rotated, so a ton of these I do think are going to be viable in Alchemy where the card pool's smaller and the power level is lower, but I also think there's a really, well, not a really big, but a bigger than usual percentage of these cards that could potentially see play in Historic and Timeless, which is really exciting. So for example, I put out an MTG Zone premium article yesterday, I'll have a link to it down in the description if you want to check it out, of 5 Historic Theorycraft deck lists built around these new cards, and honestly I do think all 5 of them have a good chance of being viable. Now obviously Historic is very difficult right now to break into the top tier at the very least because of Eldrazi, Sorin and Energy just being so much more powerful than the rest of the field, but I do feel like there are a lot of cards that could potentially either lead to new archetypes or new builds of older archetypes that haven't been around for a while. So I'm super excited to try these out in Historic. There's a couple that I do think are worth considering in Timeless as well, which is always exciting. And like I said, I think with rotation happening recently, a ton of these are going to be viable in Alchemy as well. So what I'm going to do in this video, because I know there are a lot of people who don't really care about Alchemy as a format, is I'm going to go through all the cards first, which I think have Historic and Timeless applications, obviously talking about their Alchemy applications at the same time, but then once I've gone through all the Historic and Timeless cards, I'll say, and then if you're not interested in Alchemy, but you can just shut the video off, but for the people who are, obviously I'll cover the rest of the set afterwards. So starting off with the card that I think is going to be a bit of a game changer, especially in the Eternal formats, is Thought Partition. So this is essentially a 1-mana white Thoughtseize style effect. Now we have had hand interaction in white in the past, so it's not a complete colour break really. We've had cards like Invasion of Gobekhan and Elite Spellbinder, but I always felt like these cards were balanced more because they were overcosted compared to the black hand interaction. Obviously, 3 and 2 mana for discard effects is significantly worse than 1 mana, right? There's a reason why basically none of the 2+ mana discard effects don't really see play at all anymore, because a discard spell on turn 1 just hits so many more different things. It can hit the opponent's 1 or 2 drops, it can hit their more expensive cards, because the issue with discard is if the opponent's empty-handed or they already have threats in play that you can't deal with, then discard aren't really that good. So cards like Invasion of Gobekhan and Elite Spellbinder kind of rely on you getting underneath the opponent for them to be effective, whereas white just getting a 1 mana discard effect is absolutely huge in my opinion. Now obviously there are some downsides to this compared to a Thoughtseize, for example, because if the opponent just has expensive cards in their hand, then this doesn't really do anything, right? If you're up against Eldrazi and they've already got their ramp in play and they've only got their top end, this doesn't really do anything. Even in that instance though, you can choose not to do it. I mean, that's not ideal, but and then obviously cards like Saint Elender and Overlord of the Belmerk don't get hit by this either, but all of those decks that I just mentioned have cheaper stuff that this will always hit, right? If you are against Eldrazi, using this to hit Utopia Sprawl, Malevolent Rumble, Mind Stone, even a Sowing Mocha Spawn to delay it by a turn is a really big deal. So I think this is going to be a really big deal. Now obviously a lot of decks can splash black or blue for discard spells or counter spells, but I think this is going to be especially relevant for aggressive decks, because a lot of the time in the past, aggressive decks do tend to struggle against board sweepers. They do tend to struggle against combo decks as well, you know, infinite combo decks, if they don't have a way to, you know, stop the sweeper, stop the combo going off. So typically if you are playing an aggro deck, you would often be forced into a blue or black splash to get access to those sorts of effects in order to fight against those sorts of cards. So now white just having this as a really efficient 1 mana discard spell is going to be absolutely huge. And honestly, for Historic at the very least, I am worried that Boros Energy is just going to start running 4 of this, which will fix its weakness to sweepers, it'll fix its weakness to combo, and could just be really powerful, right? If you imagine playing just Boros Energy and you can just fire this off on turn 1 against Eldrazi, hit their ramp, and then just go to town with all your, you know, really powerful 2-drops. This works really well with Amped Raptor as opposed to counter spells, you know, because you can just Amped Raptor, hit this, you know, hit one of the cards in the opponent's hands. And then there are other decks as well that I've really wanted discard effects in. For example, Naya Primal Prayers is a deck I've returned to recently because I feel like the Historic metagame right now is kind of soft to mid-range decks with an infinite combo, because then you have interaction for, you know, your Sorins and your Energies, but you have an infinite combo to go over the top of them. And then Energy, I think its natural weakness is to infinite combo, but I felt like the Naya Primal Prez deck struggled against board sweepers, interaction, and opposing combos, so I was trying to splash black in that to get access to Thoughtseize to flash back with the Jarsoul, and now we don't even need to do that. You can just, slot Thought Partition straight into there. So again, I don't think it's going to be a massive deal in Timeless, really, because with fetches you can splash a third colour relatively easily, but say you're running Boros Energy and you don't want to splash into a third colour because you want to run Blood Moon or you want to max out on Strip Mine, for example, this could be interesting there. But especially in Historic, where splashing an extra colour definitely does come at a cost, especially right now where one of the ways people are trying to tackle Eldrazi is with White Orchid Phantom and Field of Ruin style effects, so running decks with few basics can get punished pretty hard. So I think just in general, this is going to be a really, really big card, especially in Historic. Now, in terms of Alchemy, I don't think... we've already got some discard spells. We've already got black available with Duress and stuff, so I don't think this is likely to be as impactful there. Whereas Historic, everything has to be really, really efficient to be good, and this is really efficient in a colour and an archetype that's good. I still think it's going to be playable in Alchemy, but I just think for the Eternal formats, the implications of having a good, efficient white 1-mana interaction spell for the opponent's hand is a really, really big deal, and I expect to see this card a lot going forwards. Then next up, I want to go over the two cards that I think could potentially see play in Timeless. This first one is a lot more exciting to me. Hydroponics Architect. So when it attacks, turns a random land into your deck into an island that draws you a card on ETB. So the really nice thing about this in Timeless is if you're running a bunch of blue fetches, no matter what this hits, you can just fetch that card, right? It can turn a fetch land into an island. It can turn a strip mine into an island. You'll be able to fetch it with a blue fetch land. And then you can just turn your fetches into ETB draw card. It has 2 toughness. It has flying. 2 toughness can't be hit by Bowmasters, which is really important on a card that draws as part of its effect. It has flying, so it can more consistently attack. So... and obviously, you can sack it to Flare of Denial as well. So if you're running like a tempo deck, this just seems like another Tamiyo-esque card that you could run alongside it, potentially, that seems quite, reasonable to me. Obviously, you do need to be running a lot of blue fetch lands for this to be good, but, a lot of the blue-black tempo decks are already doing that to be able to run, Mana Drain and Mystic Sanctuary and stuff like that. So this does seem interesting as just another viable one-drop in those sorts of low-to-the-ground tempo decks. Not sure how good those decks are really right now, so we'll have to see if this does actually have a big impact or not, but definitely interesting there. Now, in terms of Historic, I think this is more interesting to me than the Ambassador that I'll get onto in a second, because we do have Prismatic Vista that can fetch, anything that this turns into a basic island, but I just don't quite think we have a high enough density of fetch lands, right? You really don't want to be having to run Fabled Passage in Historic for this card to be good, so I don't think this is going to be that good in Historic. In terms of Alchemy, this is pretty interesting to me in decks that are running Lander tokens, because obviously all of your Lander tokens or just any of your other land searching effects can find basics that this turns into ETB draw cards. So I definitely expect this to be good in any deck that's running Lander tokens or just general, ramp cards that search basics, but definitely an interesting card to consider for Timeless as well. Speaking of which, Ambassador of Evendo, I'm not sure how to say that one, but this has kind of a similar effect where the ceiling is a lot higher because it draws you a card every time the land gets tapped, but it's much more difficult to set up, right? This is a card, 2-mana card that does nothing. You have to wait for the landfall things to get going, really. Where, a card that's 2-mana do nothing needs to be really, really generically powerful to be good, Psychic Frog, for example. Whereas your 1-mana ones, I think there's less pressure on it because it's much easier to untap with a 1-drop than a 2-drop. So I think, this is an interesting card to consider, but it just feels like the floor on this card is a lot lower, which is a big problem in Timeless. Then in terms of other formats, again, it's much more difficult to consistently tutor the land with this compared to Hydroponics Architect, even in Alchemy, because obviously you can hit it with Lander tokens if it happens to hit a basic in your deck, but if it doesn't hit a basic, it's kind of hard to tutor the card. So again, floor is quite low even in Alchemy. So I think out of the two, Hydroponics Architect is definitely the more exciting one, but I thought it was worth bringing up both because this does have a pretty high ceiling in Timeless as well. Then next up, we've got Val Marooned Surveyor. Now, this one's really interesting because it just opens up a new combo with Trelisara. So the way this works is, as long as you have these two creatures in play and you get a first trigger on either of them. So either gain life or trigger one of the keywords on Val. You've got infinite damage, infinite life gain, and infinite scry. So it just wins the game on the spot, which is a really big deal. You know, both of these cards are 2 mana, so you can play it with Lurrus. We recently got Green Sun Zenith added to Historic and Timeless, so you can tutor for either of them fairly easily. We've still got, you know, pre-existing options like Call of Calling that works well in the Convoke shells. You've got Birthing Ritual, which can help to find these as well. So this is really interesting to me because, you know, getting these sorts of combos, especially on all cards that are 2 mana or less, makes it more, you know, quick to set up. You have a lot more kind of nut draws where you can combo off on turn 3, and it just makes the deck more low to the ground. Getting to run Lurrus in these sorts of shells is always really huge because it just gives the deck more resilience. Now, the issue with these cards to me, you know, I've already theory crafted a deck about this in that article that I was talking about in the description. Yeah, the issue with building around these 2 cards is it's very difficult to make them both good individually, right? I think in Historic right now, it's very easy to make Trelisara be good because there's just a lot of generically powerful life gain cards. You got your Guide of Souls, Ocelot Pride, and you know, you could just, you know, kind of put more life gain support within that shell, which works well with a lot of what that energy core wants to be doing. But then, you know, it's difficult to fit cards into that shell that would Discover, Investigate, Scry, Surveil, or Seek. You know, there are some cards that do this, and there were some ideas I came up with that could potentially combine them, like combining this combo with Samwise, and then, you know, you could run some of the Convoke enablers like Ropeline, and then you have Woe Strider as a sack outlet, which can scry repeatedly to trigger the Val, which then, you know, pings the opponent, which works kind of well with the sacrifice game plan. And you could run Green Sun Zenith with like one of Sephiroth's and have kind of a sacrifice sub-theme as well, but it just feels like there's too much going on, and this requires a red splash in that sort of deck as well. So I think the way that I would probably build around this is build around Trelisara, run Trelisara as a 4 alongside some kind of life game package, and then just run Val as a 1 that you can tutor with your Green Sun Zenith and stuff like that to just be able to combo off. But if anyone has any ideas in the comments for potential viable shells where you can make both cards good individually, definitely let me know, because that would solve a lot of the deck building problems with this combo. But yeah, this is very interesting, especially in Historic right now, where I do think infinite combos can be very powerful because Eldrazi, Energy, and to a lesser extent Storin, because they have discard spells. But, you know, a lot of the top decks are vulnerable to infinite combos right now, so I'm definitely going to be trying to build around this one going forwards. And then next up we've got Kavaron Consumed, which I'm really excited about this card, specifically in Historic. The main reason for that is that I'm a big fan of the Shifting Woodland decks with Ulamog and Godfarrow's Gift, but the issue with those decks is they're very, very all-in on Shifting Woodland, which makes your deck pretty inconsistent if you can't find the woodland itself, and it just makes you very vulnerable to any sort of hate card for woodland, whether that's Graveyard Hate or Pithing Needle, for example. In Modern, I've seen Aspiring Spike, great content creator, definitely check him out if you don't, but I've seen him a while ago working on a similar shell with this, but it runs through the breach as well, as just another way to kind of, you know, cheat your Ulamogs or your summoned Bahamut's or your Cityscape levelers into play, because these are probably the most powerful creatures to haste in. Obviously, the issue with Ulamog is you need to have another card exiled, but if you're running Ulamog, Summoned Bahamut, and Godfarrow's Gift, you can fairly freely run Ugin's Labyrinth, which you can then use to imprint an expensive card, which then enables you to haste in Ulamog with a bunch of counters on to go for the win. And so the reason I'm really excited for Kavaron Consumed is it's obviously not an instant compared to Through the Breach, but the fact that this can put an artifact into play is huge, because now you have another way to cheat in Godfarrow's Gift, even through Graveyard Hate, which is massive. So, you know, say for example you looting an Ulamog into the graveyard, but you don't have a Shifting Woodland, you can potentially ramp into Kavaron Consumed with your Ugin's Labyrinths and your Utopia Sprawls and your Malevolent Rumbles, and then Kavaron Consumed Godfarrow's Gift into play, which then enables you to, you know, get back that Ulamog for the win. So very, very excited to try this out. Now, the obvious downside is that there is a top-tier land destruction deck viable right now. I still personally believe the Stone Rain build is the best build of Eldrazi right now, while the Mirror is everywhere. And running a deck that runs both Shifting Woodland and Ugin's Labyrinth is pretty rough to run when a Stone Rain, Sowing Micah Spawn Worldbreaker deck is viable and, in my opinion, one of the best decks in the format. But again, you can kind of play around it with Woodland by waiting the turn that you need to activate it to play it. But either way, I do think this deck could be very generically powerful, and Kavaron Consumed could be, you know, the missing piece to give this Woodland deck just a bit more, you know, a bit more resilience is the word I'm looking for. Then next up, we've got another card that I'm really excited for in Eumidian Lifeseed. So this is basically, gives you more redundancy for Sunken Citadel, which is surprisingly a card I've been brewing with fairly recently in Historic. So the really nice thing about this card compared to Sunken Citadel is it does give you an extra land, and this is the spell book that it gives you. So there are a reasonable number of whiffs in here. I think the most exciting cards are especially Blast Zone in Historic, Mutavolt. Dust Bowl can be very good if you have got a lot of ways to discount your lands and stuff, and Sunken Citadel is obviously a card I was talking about there. But the main thing I'm excited about with this card in Historic especially is the ability for you to start firing off your Field of Ruins and Demolition Fields on turn 2. Because like I said, obviously Eldrazi is everywhere in Historic right now, and I felt like one way you could potentially try and fight that is with a deck running Sunken Citadel and then 4 Field of Ruin, 4 Demolition Field. But kind of unsurprisingly, one of the big issues with that deck was just that you don't have enough redundancy for Sunken Citadel. You're not always going to draw your 4 of, and having to wait until turn 3 to start using these is just way too slow. So now we have 8 ways that we can start firing off Field of Ruin and Demolition Field on turn 2. This obviously gives you some, an extra land as well. And it works well with cards like Blast Zone and other stuff as well. But more importantly, it also works well with Castle Garenbrig. So you could potentially run a deck that's running 4 Sunken Citadel, 4 Eumidian Lifeseed, 4 Demolition Field, 4 Field of Ruin, and then you should have a really good matchup. Well, you should have a really good way to slow down Eldrazi, which is very big at the moment. And also, there are still a number of decks in Historic that aren't running that many basics. If you are a 3-color deck running 1 or 2 basics, then, getting to fire off Field of Ruin and Demolition Field as early as turn 2 and doing it in multiples not only cuts them off mana fixing, but can start just stone raining their lands after they've run out of basics, which is a pretty big deal. And then, I think the issue with Castle Garenbrig is there aren't too many 6-mana cards in Historic that are super powerful. I think Primeval Titan's probably the best one. And then you can use it to fetch other utility lands that you can discount with your Lifeseed and your Sunken Citadel. So I think if this deck isn't viable, or the Garenbrig variants aren't viable, it's probably because of a lack of good quality 6 drops that we can ramp into. But if we do get some just generically powerful green 6 drops, this is definitely an archetype that I'm going to be bearing in mind going forwards. And also, if you are just running a green deck that isn't on Eldrazi, running this with Sunken Citadel and Field of Ruin and Demolition Field should just give you a way within your mana base to give you a fighting chance against Eldrazi and, potentially punish those more greedy mana bases as well. And then, in terms of other formats, I think this is probably just too slow for Timeless. And then, in terms of Alchemy, I mean, it is interesting, but I just don't feel like we have enough good utility lands legal in the format right now for this to be worth running. Might be wrong on that, and obviously as more cards get added to the format, this is definitely one to keep an eye on, but very excited for this one in Historic at the least. The next up, we got Drix Interlacer, which is another interesting option for Affinity in Historic, and potentially in Timeless as well, but I think I'm mainly excited for this one in Historic. So this is obviously kind of comparable to Thoughtcast and Thought Monitor, but I do have some issues with them. Obviously, Thoughtcast being a sorcery means it doesn't contribute towards any of your Affinity payoffs. It means it's a whiff when it's milled over with Emry. It can't be rebought with Emry. And then Thought Monitor, obviously, ticks a lot of the boxes that I was just talking about, but it's way more expensive. It's way more difficult to get out, especially through disruption or if you have to mulligan. Whereas this, especially now with Pinnacle Emissary being stock in most lists, seems like a really interesting way to increase your range of keepable hands and also increase your range of turn 2 Kappa Cannoneers, because I've recently been very interested in running Affinity builds that are running Pinnacle Emissary and 12 0-mana artifacts just to try and maximize those very fast starts, because I feel like turn 2 or 3 Kappa Cannoneer is by far the most powerful thing that Affinity can be doing, because I think the biggest issue with that deck is it's good at grinding into longer games and taking over the board, but it usually takes a while to close the games out unless you have those really early Kappa Cannoneers. And I feel like Drix Interlacer should increase your range of keepable hands for a start if you are running a lot of zeros, but also increase your range of turn 2 Kappa Cannoneers, because if you lead on Drix Interlacer on turn 1 and then you have that start where you have Pinnacle Emissary alongside 3 0-mana artifacts but you don't have the Kappa Cannoneer, you can go Interlacer on turn 1, then on turn 2 you go Warp Pinnacle Emissary, cast 3 0-mana artifacts, then you can crack this to draw 3 cards, and if you have an untapped land and you draw a Kappa Cannoneer on this, you still have enough artifacts in play to get Kappa Cannoneer down on turn 2 as well. So this not only is just a good tool to grind. It works very well with Embry, but it should also just increase your range of keepable hands if you are running Pinnacle Emissary with a lot of zeros. So I do think that this has a good chance of being better than the Thoughtcast and the Thought Monitor, especially because it just comes down as a 1-mana artifact. So it's a card advantage tool that also enables your other affinity payoffs. Now, obviously, the big downside of it is it's much worse to draw off the top, whereas kind of Thoughtcast and Thought Monitor can kind of chain into each other. But I feel like the affinity deck has enough ways to get triggers on this, especially with stuff like Retrofit Foundry and Embry, that I could definitely see it being the better choice in those sorts of decks, especially with Pinnacle Emissary. And next up, we've got kind of another option for affinity at the very least in Machinist Dismissal, which is a really interesting way. It's easier to turn on than Metallic Rebuke, but the fact it can't counter, the fact it can only counter non-creature spells is the main thing that's, making me a little bit apprehensive about it at the very least, because Metallic Rebuke hitting creatures does come up a fair amount. So I think this is an interesting option out of the sideboard as basically just a 1-mana negate in affinity decks. Because this is basically almost always going to cost 1 if your deck is built relatively well, especially because it counts artifact lands as well. So if you're running blue-black with both of them, or if you're running mono-blue or just blue splash, you could probably run Darksteel Citadel as well, which makes this even easier to turn on. But the fact that it can't hit creatures probably makes me think it's not quite as good as Metallic Rebuke. But I'm definitely going to be trying out on this sideboard at the very least. And then next up, we've got Candela, Aegis of Adagia. Oh, by the way, these two cards, I don't really think we have enough artifact support in Alchemy yet. Not 100% sure on that, but I think these are mainly going to be for Historic. And then I think in Timeless, there is an affinity deck there, but I'm not sure Drix Interlacer really makes the cut, but it could be worth trying there. Then next up, Candela, Aegis of Adagia. I'm not sure how to say that one. And this is kind of an interesting one to me because I've been pretty interested in these 1-mana cards that return a creature to your hand, specifically because of Amped Raptor, right? We've seen with the Pixie that bouncing Amped Raptor and recasting it is a pretty powerful thing to do, and I think that this is just a much more powerful card than the Pixie. Now, having said that, I don't think we have enough good cards within the energy shell to make this worth running yet, right? If we had other creatures with really strong ETBs, maybe if you're running Juggernaut Peddler or something like that, then this could be worth considering. But if you're just using this to bounce Raptor and Ajani, I'm not sure it's quite good enough. But if there are more ETB creatures that start getting printed and are viable in Amped Raptor shells, then this is one to consider, I think. So that's all the cards that I think could potentially see play in Historic and Timeless. So if you're not interested in Alchemy as a format, definitely feel free to click off the video. But for anyone who is interested in Alchemy, like I said, rotation has only recently just happened, so the relative power level of the format is pretty low. So I think there's a good chance that a decent number of these cards could break through and be decent. So I'm going to start off here by talking about Cantor of the Refrain, because I believe this is a card that you can just craft and put in your deck, but we also have a number of support cards that are able of conjuring this into your graveyard, and then obviously you can start recurring it from the graveyard if you've got other warp cards. Now, the big downside of Song of Point Prime is that it's sorcery speed and the opponent chooses the creature to sacrifice, but I feel like there are good enough upsides and build-arounds with Cantor of the Refrain here that it's probably worth running, assuming you have another non-conditional removal spell in your deck. You don't want to rely entirely on this, or you'll really struggle against opposing decks that commit to the board quickly. And then we've also got Voidcalled Devotee as well, which is a really interesting card because you can warp it in on turn 2, attack in, and especially if you're on the play, there's very little the opponent can do to block a 3/3 on turn 2, so you should get it back get it back in exile to be able to cast again. Then you get 2 counters into the graveyard, and I think the key card that will really tie this deck together is Timeline Color, because the way I envision this deck is kind of a low to the ground aggressive deck that has sacrifice synergies in, so that you can sacrifice your counters, sacrifice your Timeline Colors for value, get them in the graveyard, then you can warp the Timeline Color from your graveyard, which then triggers the counters to get them back from the graveyard, and they grow as well. So I really like Sephiroth in here as a way to sacrifice, start draining the opponent, apply pressure that way. Spectacle of Destruction also seems excellent in this deck. It's a card I've already been impressed with so far in Alchemy, even without these cards being added. And then, Timeline Color, I think, is going to be the big sticking point, whether you want to go into splashing into a second color. There are good options, especially for additional cards with warp. There's a lot of good white cards with warp. You could also maybe move into blue. for, I can't remember the name of it now, the 5 mana warp card with flying that draws you a card, and then you can obviously run the blue sorcery that allows you to scam your warp creatures into play, or you could just stick with mono black, go more low to the ground, run more interaction, more kind of sacrifice sub-theme stuff as well. So I'm really excited for this deck because a lot of the cards seem very generically powerful. There's a lot of good value going on. I think Sephiroth is one of the more generically powerful cards in the format, but outside of Mobilize, I don't really think there's a good home for it. This seems like an excellent home for it. Same thing with Spectacle. So this is definitely the first archetype I'm going to be playing in Alchemy, and if it does pick off, I think you're definitely going to want to run Ghost Vacuums in your sideboard going forwards. The next up, we've got Gravitic Herald. And this, when I first saw this one, my eyes kind of lit up because this looked very, very reminiscent of Inquisitor Captain, and it doesn't have the condition that Inquisitor Captain did. So initially I was like, wait, we can just run this in Historic alongside a bunch of clone effects and just swarm the board really quickly, but Warp 0 doesn't really achieve what we want here, right? You could potentially go Herald, clone, but then at the end of the turn, all your clones go into exile and you've paid 2 life for each one and not really achieved anything. So I don't really think there's a combo potential for this, so I don't think it's likely to see play there. But in terms of just using this fairly in Alchemy, this does seem generically powerful if a lot of your other, cards have good enter the battlefield abilities, right? I think that is important because if you play this and you hit a permanent that doesn't do anything when it enters and then it just gets immediately exiled into, for you to recast later, it doesn't seem very good. So I think for this to be good, you need to have a very high density of permanents that have ETB effects. But if you do, this seems like very good value, right? You go Herald, it will put the permanent in play, you get the value off it immediately, it then goes into warp so you can cast it again. So again, if you build around this, it seems good. I'm not sure it fits very cleanly into any pre-existing archetypes, but I'm definitely going to be trying this one out and see if we can make it good, because this is, if you can build around it, is very strong, I think. Speaking of which, another very strong card, Cosmic Sovereign, and I think this is maybe going to be one of the most generically powerful cards, just mainly because we have such good ramp options. We've still got Fountain Port Charmer and, wow, I'm forgetting card names left, right and centre here. The 2 mana Dork that discounts cards during your turn as well. Just, we've got very good discount stuff. We've still got Llanowar Elves in the format as well. So if you're running a ramp deck, this seems like such a good payoff for your Fountain Port Charmers and stuff like that. We've still got Smuggler's Surprise in the format, which is another archetype which I feel is quite underplayed relative to the rest of the power levels. So yeah, this looks like an excellent card. Getting this down ahead of curve, immediately getting a 3 mana creature in play that has haste. Obviously there's quite a big amount of variance with this card depending on the creature you hit. But even if you just hit like a generic 3-drop, getting into attack, getting an extra creature every single turn seems really powerful. And obviously, the really powerful thing with this is you can pump a lot of mana into the activated ability if you have nothing else to do. Say you do cast this on turn 3 or 4, pump its power up to 6 or 7 before combat and then get a really big creature in play. This seems very, very powerful to me. And again, I think this is one of the first decks that I'm going to be building as well. Fountain Port Charmer. It's also a dragon. There's a lot of synergies going on with dragons as well, right? There's the artifact that draws you a card every time you cast a dragon. So you could maybe slot this into the more interactive dragon shell as kind of a bigger finisher. But I'm much more excited for this alongside Fountain Port Charmer as a way to just get it down ahead of curve and start really applying pressure, because this seems very, very scary. It's going to force a lot of damage through very quickly. Then next we got Stoic Star-Captain, and in general there is a lot of support for like spaceships and crowing and stuff in this set, and it's quite difficult to assess the power level of these cards, because I don't think, obviously the station lands are very nice with Kona right now. I think that's the best thing to be doing with the spacecraft stuff in Alchemy right now. I don't think the rest of the support cards from the main set are really good enough for the archetype to be viable. So it's very difficult to tell whether these sorts of cards will really move the needle enough for the decks to be good. But it does seem, pretty generically powerful here. You get to seek a spacecraft card from your deck, which, if you're only running one, then this is a guaranteed way to tutor a specific spacecraft. So if your deck is kind of built more heavily around one, this seems incredibly powerful at just being able to find that one as consistently as possible. And then obviously the passive ability is really nice to enable those spacecrafts as well. So I think this is probably more interesting to me as a tutor effect. But again, if the spacecraft support is good enough where you could just make a whole deck built around synergies, this just seems like a generically powerful card there. So I think whether these sorts of cards are good depends on whether we get a high enough density of these cards. And I think it's going to be really difficult to assess whether that's going to be the case until we get to try them, right? Assessing one new card is difficult enough, but trying to assess whether a new deck is viable based on multiple new cards is going to be really tricky. But either way, I'm definitely going to be trying these out. Similar sort of thing with Squadron Carrier here. So you can get this down, and then you can, all of your spacecrafts then can conjure creatures that enable you to crew them, essentially. So I don't know, it seems interesting. Again, I think you'd need to build your whole deck around spacecrafts for this to be good. You'd need to have other spacecrafts in play that get the exhaust ability for this to be worth it, I think. So again, whether these cards see play is really dependent on whether there's enough density of good cards to make just the whole deck good enough, which is going to be tricky to find out. But so I think in general, I'm not super optimistic about these cards. But, I'm definitely going to be trying them at the very least when it comes out. The next up, we've got Mind Security. So 2 mana, 3/1 trample, aggressively statted. And then same sort of thing as the bat that we got recently. Conjures a Flame Tongue Carvu into your top 8 that costs 0. If you're not sure what Flame Tongue Carvu is, it's it doesn't matter that it's 4 mana because it'll basically be free with this card. But it's a 4/2 that deals 4 to any target, which is, huge tempo swing. If you cast this on turn 2 and then draw the Flame Tongue Carve as your next card, that's probably going to win you a lot of games. Obviously, there's a lack of consistency here. There's no good way to guarantee finding it off the top, but I think if you're playing an aggressive deck, this just seems like a good option, right? So 2 mana, 3/1 trample is, aggressively statted and, will make your next few top decks potentially very strong. If you do draw the Flame Tongue Carve, that's a ton of pressure out of nowhere. So yeah, I think if you're running a red aggressive deck, this seems like a generically good option, but I'm not sure it's better than the current ones we have access to. And there's not really too much synergy. We did get the Warp Carvu in the main set, but I don't really feel like we have enough good synergies to build around this sort of card. But if you're running a red aggressive deck, this seems just like a generically good option, I think. The next up, we got Vv'viza, Orbital Overseer. So 4 mana, 4/4 ETB, you get a planet from the spellbook, so that's just all of the planet lands that we've got in the main set, I believe. And then you can create lander tokens when it attacks and they become creatures. This seems more like a brawl card to me. I can't really see any deck wanting to build around this or wanting to run it. I could see it being fun to build around in brawl, but I don't know, it doesn't seem good enough to me for Alchemy unless there's some synergy I'm missing out on. The next time we got Cloudsculpt Armorer, which is a pretty interesting card. So it comes down, protects itself or another one of your creatures, and then, when that shield counter comes off, you get to seek a card. So this card seems like the floor isn't too bad, honestly, and the ceiling is pretty high because if you're running a lot of other cards that remove counters from cards, then this seems really powerful. And I think one of the best cards in Alchemy right now is Hardened Bonds. So there are multiple decks that already are getting a bunch of counters on creatures, and then there are ways to remove counters on generically powerful cards. Like there's the Selesnya X creature that puts counters on, and then whenever you attack you can remove counters to make a 2/2. But then again, this is kind of in awkward colors, and I'm not really sure that Hardened Bonds decks need more card advantage, right? Bonds really covers your bases there. So this seems like a generically powerful card that I'm not sure has a great home right now. But again, if there's a deck that is very good at removing counters at will, this seems like it could be like the really core card advantage engine in that deck. But again, I'm not sure we have enough support for that yet. If we do get more cards printed, before this rotates though, that is just easy to remove counters at will, this seems like it could be incredibly pushed as just a really strong kind of card advantage engine. But right now, I'm not super optimistic about it. Then next up, we got Monoist Gravliner. Again, I'm not too high on these station cards. I think the main interesting thing here is that it perpetually gives a creature death touch, which is interesting if you have creatures that can deal 1 damage to any target, because then you can use that to just pick off the opponent's creatures. Now, I'm not sure we have a creature like that in Alchemy again, but again, this is another one to bear in mind. If we do get any creatures that can, tap to deal 1 mana to any target, for example, then this seems like a kind of an interesting combo. Or especially if there's a creature like Goblin Chainwhirler that deals 1 damage to every creature the opponent has, then this seems really good as a way to give death touch. But outside of that, I'm not super high on it. I'm not super high on the spacecrafts in general. So again, I think with these cards, it would just really depend on whether all of this support comes together to form a new archetype or not. And then next up we got Brood Astronomer. So I think the main application of this card is just it's a good way to guarantee a planet or a station land in play for Kona, which seems like the best way to utilize these new station cards, right? Just cast Kona, tap it to the station card, cheat Omniscience or Dragon Typhoon or whatever into play, and this just seems like a generically good way to guarantee that you have a planet in play without having to run too many tap lands. And then it also helps to ramp into Kona as well. So if you're running Kona, this just seems like a slam dunk 4 in that deck, but I'm not really sure it's going to see play elsewhere. But yeah, definitely slots straight into a top tier deck, so definitely going to be relevant. The next up we've got Sliver Weftwinder. And again, I think this is just more of a brawl card, really. Like, we can quickly skim through the spellbook if you want, but you know, we've seen better slivers in the past. There isn't a sliver deck in Alchemy, so it doesn't seem generically powerful enough. Getting to 5 colours is going to be really difficult. So this isn't one for Alchemy, and it's just not good enough for the Eternal format. So not really too much to talk about here for non-brawl stuff. Then next up we got Volatile Orbit, which is, I think, very powerful if you can get both modes off this consistently, right? If you can get a tapped planet on turn 1, then on turn 2 you can use this to take out a creature, and then on turn 3 you can use this to ramp, which is very powerful to get off one card. But the issue with this is that, you know, I think more often than not, you're not going to consistently get, you know, that curve of 2 into 3. And if you're not getting that consistent curve, then it's not that good, right? And I don't really think there's a deck that wants to be running a high density of the red and green planets and wants to be ramping on turn 3, right? Obviously, Kona could want to run a high density of these, but Kona wants to ramp from 2 to 4, not 3 to 5. So not only does it feel like this is a lot of hoops to jump through, I just don't feel like there's a deck that wants to be running a high density of planets and ramping from 3 to 5. So again, this is another one that is powerful if you can enable it consistently, but I'm just not sure there's a deck that consistently wants to do this sort of thing, if that makes sense. The next up we've got Mutable Puta. Not sure how you say that, but this is another really interesting one where I think, hold on, I'll scroll down so you can see it's a 1/1 with Evolve, so obviously this is going to grow pretty quickly. This is very interesting for Hardened Bonds decks, because I've been obviously trying decks like a lot of other people with Hardened Bonds and Bright Glass Gearhulk, which obviously has keywords on as well and just grows as you play more creatures. I don't really feel like this is worth building around too much with these keywords, really. You know, obviously, you know, you could play this alongside Priest of Possibility and Historic, but I don't think that sort of deck is particularly good. But in Alchemy, I think if you're going to run this, it's probably alongside Hardened Bonds, and if you just happen to be running creatures like Bright Glass Gearhulk that just happen to have keywords on them, it's just nice upside to get them on this creature as well. So this seems like a good option in Hardened Bonds, potentially. Also in Mono Green, I've seen some Mono Green this running the... I'm forgetting all the card names today, but the squirrel that allows you to play off the top that costs double green, and then you've obviously got, you know, a lot of top end that's good in green at the moment that will grow the pupa as the game goes on. So this seems good in Mono Green aggressive decks and also in Hardened Bonds as well, potentially. And then next up we got Network Marauder, which is kind of reminiscent of Simulacrum Synthesizer, but I think is just worse. I think these kind of effects that buff creatures in your deck, I don't know, they're not that great because they just don't impact the board at all, and they're quite slow in the way that you get the benefit, if that makes sense. I also don't think there's much benefit with the warp here, really, right? If this was just artifacts that cost, you know, anything, then that would be really interesting, because then you could warp this in Historic and then cast 0-mana artifacts like Ornithopter potentially and start buffing stuff in your deck. But I don't know, doesn't really seem good enough there. And again, I'm not really sure we have good enough artifact support in Alchemy yet. Maybe we're getting a high enough density between what we've got and in this set, but again, I'm not super optimistic about it. So this is probably one where if we get more artifact support as the set gets more cards, then maybe this is worth revisiting. But I'm more hesitant about these sort of effects that buff cards in your deck, because it's just a slow payoff that you're not always going to get, really. And then next up we've got Worldweave. Now this card seems really interesting to me. It is slow, but it is generically very powerful. Again, I'm not really sure there's good enough payoffs in Alchemy though, right? You know, casting creatures to ramp you is a very powerful effect to have, but I feel like the real benefit of this would be if you had generically powerful utility lands that you want to consistently find, right? If you could play this with something like a Field of the Dead, then this would be really interesting, or like a Valakut or something. But I don't know, it's too slow for Historic, where those sorts of lands are sometimes legal. And I think in Alchemy, it just feels too slow to me, right? You cast this on turn 3, it doesn't really do anything. Then you cast creatures and you start getting lands. But at that point, you know, you're already nearest the top of your curve, right? Once you hit 4 or 5 lands, is there really that much more that you can do? I mean, obviously, you could run X creatures that you could really maximize off this. You could run really expensive creatures, but then if you have your really expensive creatures and you don't have Worldweave, there's not a good way to consistently get to them. So, I don't know, this feels like more of a card that's probably made for Brawl, and if there's a lot of X creatures, or I guess this could work well with Smuggler's Surprise, but again, it's an engine card that doesn't produce card advantage either, so I could see a lot of instances where you have this in play and you top deck a creature and you play the creature and this gets a land in play, but it doesn't really help because then you have more mana than you need and not enough, you know, gas to cast it with. So I don't know, it's a very powerful effect for sure, but I just feel like, first of all, there isn't really a deck that wants to be running it, and it just seems a little bit too slow to me, even for Alchemy, but we'll see. The next up is Axaver Fate Thief, which is kind of a bizarre one. We're getting more heist support when basically all of the heist cards have just rotated, so I think for the current format, we just have to evaluate this card as like a generic mid-range card, unless there are some heist cards that are still legal that I forgot about. And I guess if you're running this alongside a bunch of destruction-based interaction, it could be reasonable as kind of like a similar effect to Spectacle of Destruction, where you can get the, you know, you can warp this and then kill an opponent's creature and then, you know, discard a card to heist. And I do believe, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but similar to Lootmonger and previous effects like this, you should be able to heist even if you're empty-handed, which is pretty interesting. So maybe you could run a mid-range deck with Axavar and Spectacle of Destruction and a bunch of, interaction that kills the opponent's creatures, but then the whole deck kind of relies on the opponent playing early creatures for you to kill, which not every deck is going to run. So, I don't know. And I don't think those sorts of decks are good enough, really, because your matchup spreads are so disparate, where you're really, really good against just the low to the ground creature decks, and your deck does virtually nothing against the rest of the field. So might be missing something on this one, and especially if we do get more heist support coming over the next few Alchemy sets, then this is worth returning to. But as a generic mid-range threat, I'm not really sold on this one yet. And then finally, we've got Thendar the Overminer, 4/4 Menace. This one kind of confuses me because it looks like it should be the top end of an aggro deck, right? You really want to trigger this the turn it comes down, so you want 2 or more tap creatures. Although I guess you don't need to be playing an aggressive deck to tap creatures because of the station lands, but I don't think there's enough support for a station deck to be good. The only deck that really wants to be running station lands right now is Kona, that doesn't want to be running this. So this is an interesting card, but I don't really think it's got a good home right now. Even if you're running a red aggressive deck, I think you would want your top ends to just apply more pressure, which I guess this does in a way because it's a 4/4 Menace. So I think if this does see play, it's likely in the sideboard of red aggressive decks as a way to take out utility lands, because I don't think you do this quick enough to cut the opponent off mana, right? Like, the idea here is that you could cut the opponent off their fixing and leave them with a bunch of wastes that they can't cast stuff, but it does that too slowly, I think. I think the main application of this would be to kill utility lands, and right now in Alchemy, I think the only deck that has, utility lands that are important to kill are Kona decks, where you can take out the station lands to stop them tapping at the turn it comes down, but even then they run it in multiples, so I'm not sure how effective this would be. I think, again, if you're running an aggressive deck against Kona, you're better off just running instant speed removal to kill the Kona before they tap it, rather than running this. So I'm a bit confused by this one. This definitely feels like one where I might be missing something, so definitely let me know in the comments if I am. But this just kind of seems like an awkward card where there just isn't really a good home for it right now, but we'll see. But anyway, that's the set. Gone through all the cards, and I do think shortly after rotation, Alchemy sets are always going to have a really big impact, because they tend to have some very push cards compared to the main sets that have come out. But I'm personally more excited for this in Historic. I mean, I've definitely tried the cards, those couple cards in Timeless as well, but there's a big number of cards here that I do think could see play in Historic, especially Thought Partition. I think, Boros Energy with 4 Thought Partition Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that seems like a very scary prospect to me, especially because I think Energy is one of the top decks right now, and one of its weaknesses is a lack of ways to stop sweepers from the sideboard, to stop combo decks going over the top of you. So potentially getting to, you know, just run Forethought Partition without needing a splash, so your mana base is clean, you're still low to the ground, you can still run multiple basics to play through, you know, White Orchid Phantom effects and stuff like that. Maybe I'm overreacting about that specifically, but yeah, there seems like there's some big cards in this set that I'm really excited to try out. Definitely let me know in the comments if you think there's any applications of these cards that I missed out, whether that's for Historic, whether that's for Timeless, or for Alchemy as well. And let me know what you're thinking of building when it does drop tomorrow. But either way, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Big up.